So imagine this. You move into a quiet little neighborhood, you pay your dues, you keep your lawn trimmed, and then the HOA decides you're their next target. First come the letters, then the threats. And just when you think it can't get any worse, there's a knock at your door. Not the mailman, not your neighbor, but cops. Or at least that's what they wanted you to think. Because when those fake officers showed up, the real sheriff was already inside the house. What happened next? Well, buckle up, because this HOA power trip turned into one of the wildest takedowns you'll ever hear. It all began with a letter, printed on cheap paper, but wrapped in the pretense of authority. The envelope had no stamp, no return address, only a block of bold capital letters that said HOA enforcement. It was slipped into the mailbox one late afternoon, folded neatly, as if whoever delivered it wanted the recipient to know it was placed there by hand, not by post. The letter accused the homeowner of violating a vague clause about non-compliant exterior conditions. It didn't specify what, only that an infraction had been noted and would be subject to escalating fines. The wording was sharp, the formatting official-looking, with bold sections and legal references that seemed copied from somewhere else. It carried the tone of power, but the details were suspiciously hollow. At first, the letter seemed easy to dismiss. Homeowners associations were known for nitpicking. Sometimes it was a trash can left out too long, a flower bed planted in the wrong shape, or a fence painted the wrong shade. But the strange thing about this particular letter was not the complaint itself. It was the threat attached to it. At the bottom, in oversized print, it warned that failure to comply may result in visits from authorities, including law enforcement personnel. That phrasing stuck out like a thorn. No HOA had the power to send police to enforce cosmetic guidelines. At most, they could file civil actions or tack on fines. Yet here it was, written in black ink as if they were summoning a badge. The homeowner, weary but curious, set the letter aside, assuming it was another intimidation tactic. But over the next week, 2 more letters arrived. One was taped directly to the door, another tucked under a windshield wiper, all with the same formatting and the same escalating tone. By the third, the language had shifted from threats of fines to threats of personal visits. Then, late one evening, headlights appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. 2 cars, dark-colored and idling, lingered at the curb. Their lights were left on, beams cutting across the driveway like searchlights. The engines ran for 15 minutes, then pulled away slowly, making no effort to conceal their surveillance. It was the kind of behavior that raised goosebumps, the kind that felt more deliberate than random. By now, suspicion had hardened into certainty. Something wasn't right with the HOA. Most boards were made of nosy neighbors with too much time on their hands, but this was different. The escalation from letters to intimidation, and now strange cars loitering outside, carried the weight of something more sinister. It was as if someone on the board had decided to weaponize fear, and they were testing how far they could push. Days passed in uneasy silence. Then one morning the doorbell rang. On the porch stood 2 men wearing uniforms that resembled police attire, dark shirts with badges pinned high, heavy belts with equipment clipped on, and the kind of authoritative stance that suggested they were used to being obeyed. One of them knocked on the doorframe with the side of his fist, firm and deliberate. Through the window, their patches looked generic, not tied to any recognizable department. The badges caught the light but were duller than real polished metal, more like props than credentials. Something about their posture was off too, stiff, almost rehearsed. They carried themselves as if mimicking what they thought law enforcement should look like. They never identified themselves clearly, only knocked and lingered, waiting. For anyone less observant, it might have been enough to fool them. But the homeowner, cautious and suspicious, did not open the door. Instead, they stayed quiet, heart pounding, as the men knocked a second time, then left a folded notice on the porch. The sound of their boots faded, and the cars idled once more before leaving the street. When the notice was retrieved, it was written in the same HOA letterhead, only now stamped with a crude emblem that attempted to mimic a sheriff's office seal. The threat was blunt. Failure to comply would result in law enforcement intervention and potential removal from the premises. It was brazen, almost absurd, but terrifying in its audacity. The message was clear. The HOA, or someone claiming to act on its behalf, was willing to impersonate police to get compliance. That night, the realization settled in heavy. If they were willing to go this far, what would come next? Fake arrests? Forced entry? Real violence? The impersonation of law enforcement wasn't just an intimidation tactic, it was a crime. And crimes like that didn't stay hidden forever. The following morning, the homeowner made a decision. Instead of calling the number listed on the notices, they dialed the actual county sheriff's office. It was better to verify than to sit in silence, waiting for another knock. When the dispatcher confirmed that no deputies had been sent, and that no official department had any record of involvement, the truth was laid bare. Whoever those men were, they were not law enforcement, and whoever had sent them had crossed a dangerous line. The sheriff's office promised to look into it, though their tone carried a mix of caution and disbelief. Impersonation cases were rare but not unheard of, and usually tied to scams or intimidation. But impersonating officers in broad daylight at someone's front door was another matter entirely. The waiting began again. No further letters arrived that week. No cars idled outside. It was as if the sudden spotlight of real law enforcement had forced the perpetrators to retreat into the shadows. Yet the silence was not comforting. It was the kind of silence that felt like holding one's breath before something worse. Then, a week later, it happened. Another knock on the door, louder this time, more insistent. The sound echoed through the house, rattling the glass. But when the door was opened, it wasn't the same two imposters waiting outside. It was the real sheriff, and the look on his face said he already knew something wasn't right. The sheriff stood at the doorstep with the kind of quiet weight that carried authority without needing to announce it. His uniform bore the official county insignia, polished and unmistakable, the kind of details no imposter could replicate. He wasn't accompanied by a squad car parked down the street or a heavy-handed show of force. He came alone, his presence calm but deliberate, as though he knew the situation demanded more than a casual check-in. He explained his reason for being there, not with words, but with posture. His eyes scanned the property, pausing at the taped notices still collected inside. His gaze moved over the doorframe, the windows, and the street beyond. It was clear he had already been briefed, or perhaps he had taken it upon himself to see the problem firsthand. The truth had already been confirmed over the phone. No deputies had been dispatched in prior weeks, which meant that whoever had been knocking at the door before were frauds, men pretending to carry the weight of the law while delivering HOA ultimatums. Now, with the sheriff standing in the threshold, the contrast between real authority and the counterfeit version that had come before was striking. He asked to see the letters, the folded notices, the crude seal that had been designed to mimic his department's emblem. One by one, the papers were handed over, and one by one, his expression darkened. He didn't need to say much. The fakes spoke for themselves, bad imitations of official formatting, phrases that no law enforcement officer would ever use, threats that rang with absurdity when read aloud. Yet absurdity was what made them dangerous. For anyone less cautious, less suspicious, they could have been convincing enough. The sheriff lingered longer than expected, making notes, examining the porch where the imposters had stood, even glancing at the neighbors' driveways as though assessing whether anyone else had seen. He asked quietly if there had been cars idling, men watching. When the details were confirmed, his jaw tightened. This wasn't just harassment. It was organized, coordinated. What unsettled him most, perhaps, was the brazenness of it all. Impersonating an officer wasn't just a misdemeanor, it was a felony. To do it in broad daylight, in a neighborhood where anyone could have seen, suggested arrogance or desperation. Whoever had orchestrated this had either underestimated how quickly the truth could unravel or believed themselves untouchable. The sheriff promised that the matter would not be left to linger. He would open a case, gather evidence, and determine exactly who was behind the impersonations. He took the letters with him as evidence, carefully sealed, and left with a steady reassurance that the law was, at last, paying attention. For the homeowner, The moment the sheriff drove away was filled with mixed emotions. Relief, because real authority was finally on their side, but also dread, because exposure often provokes escalation. If the HOA board, or someone acting through it, had been bold enough to send fake police once, what would they do now that the real sheriff had been made aware? The following days became a watchful blur. Every sound outside at night, every pair of headlights rolling past, every creak of the mailbox in the morning carried new weight. Each neighbor's glance seemed sharper, less casual. The air itself carried tension, like a storm waiting to break. The neighborhood wasn't large. Most houses looked the same, modest, suburban, with trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. On the surface, it was the picture of order, the very reason HOAs claimed to exist. But beneath the manicured hedges and uniform paint colors was something far uglier. Rumors had always circulated about the board, its president who thrived on intimidation, its treasurer who leveraged rules for personal grudges, its meetings where votes were recorded selectively, sometimes not at all. Most homeowners grumbled privately, but compliance was the easier path. Few wanted to risk fines, liens, or harassment. That compliance was the board's power. But now, one homeowner had stepped out of line in a way the board hadn't anticipated. Not by refusing to mow their grass or repaint their shutters, but by pulling real law enforcement into the picture. That act alone shifted the balance. 3 nights after the sheriff's visit, another envelope appeared. This time it wasn't stamped with fake seals. It bore the HOA's official letterhead, embossed with its insignia, the one registered with the state. But the tone was no less hostile. It claimed that the homeowner had misrepresented facts and invited unwarranted scrutiny upon the board. It insisted that outside authorities had no jurisdiction in community matters and warned that continued interference would result in severe consequences, both legal and financial. The irony was rich. The board, exposed, now sought to reframe itself as the victim, painting the homeowner as the aggressor for daring to involve the sheriff. The letter was carefully worded, more polished than the crude threats that came before, but its venom was no less obvious. It was clear then that the board was not acting out of ignorance. They knew exactly what had been done, and they were scrambling to regain control of the narrative. The letters, the imposters, the intimidation, all of it pointed to a coordinated attempt to break someone into compliance. And when that attempt failed, their next strategy was gaslighting, reframing the entire ordeal as a fabrication. But the sheriff had already seen the fake notices. He had held them in his hands. Whatever spin the board attempted now would not erase that fact. Still, the shift in tactics raised a new concern. What came next? When intimidation failed, when narrative control faltered, what would the board, or those acting under its shadow, resort to next? The answer arrived sooner than expected. It happened on a Saturday morning when the neighborhood was busiest, with lawn mowers humming and children playing in driveways. A white SUV, unmarked but unfamiliar, pulled into the cul-de-sac. 3 men stepped out dressed in plain clothes but moving with purpose. They carried clipboards, not weapons, but their demeanor carried the same air of enforcement as the imposters before. They walked directly to the homeowner's property, inspecting the yard, peering at the gutters, taking photos as though building a case. When approached, they offered no clear explanation, only muttering something about compliance checks. Their badges, when briefly flashed, were not police insignias but flimsy plastic cards bearing the HOA emblem. It was theater, nothing more. Yet the performance was designed to be seen. Neighbors watched from porches, from behind curtains, their silence heavy. The message was clear. The board was putting on a show of dominance, reminding everyone who was in control. The sheriff was called again, and this time he arrived faster. His marked vehicle rolled down the street, lights off but presence unmistakable. The 3 men scattered almost immediately, climbing back into the SUV and pulling away before he even stepped out. Their flight spoke louder than any confrontation could have. The sheriff stood in the driveway, frustration etched on his face. He had seen enough to know this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate harassment, escalating step by step, and now it was unfolding in public view. This time his reassurance was heavier. He promised an investigation not only into the impersonations, but into the HOA itself, the board members, their authority, their misuse of power. If the board was abusing its position, the law would peel back the layers until the truth surfaced. Yet with that promise came a warning: exposure takes time, and desperate people often act rashly when cornered. That warning echoed in the homeowner's mind long after the sheriff left, because desperation, in the hands of those who believed themselves untouchable, was a dangerous thing indeed. And sure enough, within days, desperation revealed itself in its boldest form yet. The next knock on the door was not from imposters, not from HOA inspectors, and not even from the sheriff. It was from a process server, holding papers that claimed the HOA had filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit arrived in a crisp manila envelope delivered by a process server who appeared almost apologetic to be holding it. He left as quickly as he came, and in his absence the silence of the house seemed heavier. Inside the envelope were neatly bound pages stamped with the HOA's insignia, bearing the weight of legal jargon designed not to seek justice, but to intimidate. The allegations were sprawling. The homeowner was accused of defamation of the board, of willful disruption of community harmony, of harassment through false accusations, and even of trespass against the rights of collective governance. Each phrase was a masterclass in vagueness, stitched together with language that sounded official but carried little substance. It was not a lawsuit designed to win in court. It was a lawsuit designed to bleed. The intent was obvious: legal fees, court dates, the endless drain of time and money. It was a weaponization of the civil system, wielded not for resolution, but for punishment. The board knew that few homeowners had the resources to endure such a battle. Compliance through exhaustion was their goal, but the HOA had underestimated the homeowners' resolve. What they didn't account for was that the sheriff, now personally involved, had already begun collecting evidence of impersonation. What they didn't account for was that legal intimidation, when exposed to daylight, often backfired. In the days that followed, the lawsuit became a whispered topic among neighbors. Copies of the filing circulated in hushed tones, some homeowners shaking their heads in disbelief, others nervously avoiding the subject altogether. Most knew the board operated aggressively, but few had ever seen its tactics spill into such brazen territory. For many, it was a grim reminder of why compliance was easier than resistance. Yet beneath the gossip, a shift was happening. The more the board pushed, the more cracks appeared in its facade of authority. Homeowners who had once rolled their eyes and signed checks began to wonder if the leadership had finally overstepped. Some whispered about how strange it was that the sheriff himself had been involved. Others quietly admitted that they, too, had received letters that seemed questionable, letters that now, in hindsight, felt like precursors to the same intimidation campaign. The homeowner, meanwhile, prepared for battle. The first step was to consult a lawyer, someone versed not only in HOA disputes, but in the darker games boards sometimes played. The attorney, upon reading the lawsuit, smirked at the absurdity of the claims. The document, he said, was filled with half-truths and posturing, a Frankenstein's monster of accusations designed to scare, not to stand in court. He agreed to take the case, confident that the law was on their side. Still, confidence didn't erase the weight of the fight ahead. Court dates were set, depositions loomed, and the threat of mounting legal bills hung overhead. The board, with its pooled funds drawn from homeowner dues, had resources at its disposal. It wasn't just one neighbor against another, it was one person against an institution that had built itself into the community's skeleton. The first hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. In the days leading up to it, the tension in the neighborhood sharpened. The HOA president was seen strutting along the sidewalks, speaking loudly on his phone about legal victories and putting troublemakers in their place. Other board members avoided eye contact, their nervous glances betraying more than they said aloud. It was clear they were invested in the performance of strength, projecting dominance even as cracks deepened beneath the surface. When the morning of the hearing arrived, the courtroom became the new battlefield. On one side sat the homeowner and their attorney, calm but focused. On the other side, the board arrived with a small entourage, suited, stiff, and visibly eager to display authority. Their attorney, polished but smug, carried binders of documents stacked high, as though quantity alone could substitute for substance. The judge, however, was not easily swayed. From the very start, he demanded clarity. Each accusation had to be backed by evidence, not just rhetoric. One by one, the board's claims faltered under scrutiny. Their defamation argument lacked proof of harm. Their false accusations claim crumbled when the sheriff's ongoing investigation was mentioned. Their assertion that the homeowner had disrupted community harmony was dismissed as subjective with no measurable standard. Then came the pivotal moment. The homeowner's attorney presented the counterfeit notices, the fake police seals, the threatening language, the evidence that someone, under the banner of the HOA, had impersonated law enforcement. The judge leaned forward, his expression sharpening. This was no longer a petty neighborhood squabble. This was criminal territory, and it hung in the air like a thundercloud. The board's attorney attempted to distance his clients from the documents, claiming ignorance, suggesting they were fabricated or delivered by unknown actors. But the sheriff's statement, submitted as evidence, cut through the noise. It confirmed that his department had no record of such visits and that the documents bore fraudulent insignias. The judge's demeanor shifted from stern to cold. He ordered that the lawsuit proceed no further until the matter of the impersonations was fully investigated. He made it clear that if the HOA or anyone acting under its authority had engaged in such behavior, the consequences would be severe. The board's plan had backfired spectacularly. What they intended as a crushing blow had become a spotlight, illuminating their misconduct for all to see. When the hearing adjourned, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The board members left quickly, avoiding eye contact, their earlier bravado stripped away. The homeowner left with the knowledge that the tide had begun to turn. Back in the neighborhood, news spread faster than wildfire. Whispers turned to open conversations. Neighbors who had once remained silent began asking questions about dues, about fines, about the strange authority the board wielded. For the first time, people spoke not with resignation, but with curiosity and even defiance. But victory in court was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger. Because cornered institutions rarely collapse quietly. They thrash, they strike, they attempt to reassert control by any means necessary, and true to form, the HOA did not retreat gracefully. Days after the hearing, another message arrived. Not through letters, not through notices, but through action. Late one evening, security cameras caught figures near the edge of the property line. Not imposters in uniform this time, but hooded silhouettes, moving quickly, attempting to plant something near the driveway. The footage, grainy but clear enough, showed them fleeing when a motion light flicked on. The next morning, a fresh notice appeared in the mailbox, this one claiming that hazardous materials had been improperly stored on the property. It was absurd, laughable even, but paired with the nighttime activity, it revealed a chilling pattern. The board was no longer just pushing paper. They were orchestrating stunts, planting evidence, building false narratives brick by brick. The sheriff, when shown the footage, grew graver still. What had started as harassment had become conspiracy. What had begun as intimidation had evolved into something resembling organized crime, and as the investigation deepened, the homeowner realized that the battle was no longer about one property or one person's refusal to bow to power. It had become about dismantling a corrupt system that thrived on fear, manipulation, and control. The HOA had declared war, but in doing so, it had revealed its hand. And now, the fight was only just beginning. The investigation did not stay quiet for long. What began as one sheriff visiting a homeowner's porch grew into something larger. Detectives, clerks, and investigators piecing together timelines, statements, and financial records. Each thread they pulled revealed another knot, and the deeper they dug, the more the HOA's image of neat suburban order crumbled. At first, the board tried to downplay everything. They insisted that the impersonated officers were outsiders, opportunists with no ties to the community. They suggested the counterfeit notices were elaborate hoaxes, designed by the homeowner to create chaos. But these excuses collapsed under scrutiny. The fraudulent letters bore details, phrases, formatting, even contact numbers that matched official HOA communications. Too many similarities to be coincidence, too many overlaps to be dismissed as fabrication. The sheriff's office began interviewing neighbors, and the questions spread unease like ripples in a pond. Residents who had quietly endured fines and letters for years were suddenly asked if they had ever received documents that seemed unusual, or if anyone had ever come to their door posing as law enforcement. Slowly, stories trickled out. A neighbor 2 streets over admitted that a compliance officer had once threatened to tow their car unless they paid a fine on the spot. Another recalled a uniformed deputy knocking late at night about trash cans left at the curb. Each story was eerily similar: intimidation, vague authority, and the unspoken expectation of compliance. The board's tactics, once isolated and whispered about, were being stitched together into a pattern of harassment that extended far beyond one homeowner. In the neighborhood, tension thickened. Some residents, emboldened by the sheriff's interest, began speaking openly about years of grievances: fines for holiday decorations, threats for planting the wrong type of grass, endless fees for minor infractions. They began meeting informally, sharing stories on porches and in driveways, comparing experiences like puzzle pieces. For the first time, they realized that what each had thought was personal misfortune was, in fact, systemic abuse. Others, however, clung to the board's narrative. They muttered that the sheriff was overstepping, that community matters should stay within the community. They argued that the rules, strict as they were, kept property values high and homes desirable. For them, obedience was safety, and any challenge to the board felt like chaos. Lines were being drawn, neighbor against neighbor, loyalty against suspicion. What had once been a quiet cul-de-sac now simmered with whispered debates and sideways glances. The board, feeling the walls close in, doubled down. They held an emergency meeting, sending flyers taped to every mailbox, declaring that external interference threatened the stability of the neighborhood. The flyer claimed the board was under attack from false narratives and warned that legal costs could skyrocket if the harassment continued. They urged residents to rally together and stand strong against disruption. The meeting, held in the community center, was tense from the start. The board president stood at the podium, voice booming, attempting to project control. He spoke of unity, of order, of the importance of protecting property values. He framed the investigation as an assault on their way of life, insisting that the board's authority was the only shield against disorder. But murmurs in the crowd betrayed the cracks. Some residents shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered to each other, shaking their heads. A handful stood up and demanded answers. Why had fake officers shown up at doorsteps? Why had notices carried fraudulent seals? Why was the sheriff involved if nothing was wrong? The president brushed off these questions with practiced vagueness, but the unease was palpable. The illusion of control was slipping. Back at the sheriff's office, the investigation turned sharper. Financial records revealed discrepancies in HOA dues. Thousands of dollars collected under the guise of fines and special assessments were missing. Transfers had been made to accounts linked not to the association, but to individuals on the board. The sheriff now had more than impersonation on his hands. He had embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The homeowner, once the board's target, found themselves at the center of something larger than personal harassment. They were now a witness in a case that could dismantle the entire structure of power that had ruled the neighborhood for years. But with this role came new danger. Late one evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops, a knock sounded at the door. It was softer this time, cautious. When the door was opened, a neighbor stood there. Someone who had lived 2 houses down for years, always quiet, always polite. He leaned in, voice hushed, warning that the board was watching closely. He claimed he had overheard the president speaking angrily at the meeting, vowing to make an example of anyone who defied him. The warning was chilling, but not surprising. Cornered power often lashes out, and the board was nothing if not cornered. That week, small acts of sabotage appeared. Trash cans were overturned at the curb. A car tire mysteriously flattened overnight. Mail went missing, only to be found later, crumpled and wet. None of it could be directly tied to the board, but the timing was no coincidence. It was intimidation, petty but pointed. The sheriff, when informed, only grew more determined. Surveillance was suggested. Patrol cars began cruising the street more frequently. Quietly, cameras were installed at key points, watching the comings and goings that had once been overlooked. And then came the discovery that shifted everything. One of the counterfeit uniforms worn by the fake officers was found, stuffed into a trash bin behind the community center. It bore no official markings, only patches crudely sewn on, but it was unmistakably the same style as those worn at the door weeks earlier. Alongside it were scraps of paper, practice prints of the counterfeit sheriff's seal discarded like drafts of a forgery. The evidence was damning. It tied the impersonators directly to the community's own hub, the very building where the board held its meetings and stored its records. No longer could they claim outsiders or hoaxes. The trail led straight to their doorstep. News of the discovery spread quickly, whispered through the neighborhood like wildfire. For some residents, it confirmed what they had long suspected, that the board operated not as caretakers of the community, but as a cartel of control, bending rules for personal gain. For others, it was a jarring wake-up call, impossible to deny. The board, desperate, responded with fury. They circulated another flyer, this one claiming sabotage, that enemies of the community had planted the uniforms and forged evidence. They insisted on loyalty, demanded trust, and warned of dire consequences for those who betrayed the association. But their words rang hollow now. Too much evidence had surfaced, too many stories aligned. The illusion of legitimacy was cracking, and behind it was the rot of corruption. The homeowner watched as the neighborhood transformed around them. Where once lawns were trimmed in obedient silence, now clusters of neighbors gathered to talk, to share, to plan. Some spoke openly of recalling the board, of voting them out, of taking back control of the community. Others feared the chaos such an upheaval might bring, still clinging to the idea that order, even corrupt order, was safer than none. The sheriff's investigation was not yet complete, but its momentum was undeniable. Each day brought new revelations, new witnesses, new pieces of the puzzle. And each day the board grew more frantic, their grip slipping inch by inch. But desperate leaders do not surrender quietly. They do not accept exposure gracefully. They scheme, they retaliate, they strike at the heart of those who threaten their rule. And late one night, as storm clouds gathered overhead, the homeowner discovered a fresh notice taped to their door. This one was different. It bore no HOA insignia, no counterfeit seal. Only a single line written in thick black ink, all capital letters. You should have kept quiet. The note taped to the door changed everything. Previous threats had been wrapped in the trappings of authority. Phony badges, counterfeit seals, letters printed on official letterhead. They had always carried the pretense of rules, laws, and policies. But this one was stripped bare, raw, and blunt. No pretense of legality. No illusion of compliance. Just a warning that was closer to menace than message. You should have kept quiet. The words echoed in the house long after the paper had been peeled off and tucked into an evidence bag. It was not the HOA's voice speaking now. It was the voice of desperation. It was the moment where intimidation gave up the disguise of authority and revealed itself for what it was. Fear of being caught. The sheriff's deputies took the threat seriously. Patrol cars lingered longer at the end of the street. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles circling, headlights off, creeping past late at night. The surveillance cameras installed earlier caught one of them, a dark pickup slowing near the driveway, pausing as if to watch, then driving off. The plate was obscured by mud, deliberate and careful. The sheriff, briefed on every detail, warned that the investigation was close to reaching its breaking point. Evidence against the board was piling up. Financial records showing missing funds, counterfeit uniforms traced to the community center, and now direct threats meant to silence a witness. What began as an impersonation case was mutating into something larger: fraud, intimidation, possibly even conspiracy charges. But as law enforcement closed in, the board lashed out harder. The following week, The homeowner woke to find their yard vandalized. Lawn ornaments shattered, flower beds torn up, spray paint scrawled across the driveway in jagged letters. Liar. It was childish, almost laughable in its immaturity, but its purpose was unmistakable. It was designed to humiliate, to isolate, to make the target feel despised in their own neighborhood. Neighbors whispered about the incident, but whispers were no longer unanimous in tone. Some shook their heads, muttering that things had gone too far, that the board had lost its way. Others avoided the subject altogether, refusing to look at the spray paint as they drove past, pretending it wasn't there. Silence, after all, was safer, but silence was cracking. Small groups of residents began to gather more openly, their frustrations spilling into words. They spoke of years of fines, arbitrary rules, and bullying tactics. They shared stories of intimidation that had once seemed isolated but now formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. The sheriff's presence in the community emboldened them. If the law was watching, perhaps it was finally safe to speak. The board responded with its own campaign. Letters went out claiming that a small faction of residents was conspiring to destroy the association. Flyers warned that law enforcement interference would lead to higher dues, stricter rules, and financial ruin. The president, once so confident, now stalked the neighborhood with clenched fists and a voice raised louder than ever, as if volume could drown out the truth. Then came the breaking point. One night, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the street. A rock had been hurled through the homeowner's window, landing on the living room floor. Attached was another note, this one shorter than the last. Last warning. The sheriff was called immediately. Deputies swarmed the property, photographing the glass, collecting fingerprints, canvassing the neighborhood. But the act had already sent its message. The board, or those loyal to it, were willing to escalate from intimidation to outright violence. The thin veil of civility that once cloaked their actions had been ripped away. The sheriff, grim and steady, called for patience. He explained that investigations take time, that charges must be backed by airtight evidence. But even as he urged calm, his tone carried urgency. This was no longer about fines, dues, or property values. This was about control, and the lengths to which desperate people would go to maintain it. Behind the scenes, the sheriff's office was preparing. Warrants were being drafted. Surveillance footage was being compiled. Financial audits were underway. The case was no longer a local nuisance. It was on its way to becoming a county-level scandal. Meanwhile, the neighborhood teetered on the edge of fracture. Some residents, emboldened, began organizing to recall the board. Petitions circulated quietly, signatures collected discreetly. Others, still loyal to the president, dug in harder, muttering about outsiders meddling and neighbors betraying neighbors. Driveways became lines of division, and casual greetings turned into wary silences. The community, once uniform in its order, now showed its seams. The homeowner, caught in the middle, felt the pressure from both sides. On one hand, neighbors offered quiet thanks, slipping notes of support into the mailbox, promising that change was coming. On the other, there were cold stares, muttered insults, and cars that slowed a little too long outside the house at night. The sheriff reassured them that progress was being made, but progress was invisible. The vandalism, the notes, the creeping vehicles, those were visible. They were reminders that the board's grip, though slipping, was still strong enough to harm. Then, a breakthrough came. Detectives managed to connect the counterfeit uniforms to a local vendor who supplied theatrical costumes. Records showed a bulk purchase made under the name of a board member's relative. The receipt was dated just weeks before the first impersonation incident. It was the missing link, the chain tying suspicion to fact. With that, the sheriff's office moved. Warrants were signed. A raid on the community center was scheduled, quiet but deliberate. Inside, investigators found boxes of documents, letters drafted, seals half-printed, even drafts of the flyers distributed in recent weeks. It was a treasured trove of evidence, enough to prove intent, coordination, and conspiracy. But while the law prepared its case, the board made one final move. On the night before arrests were expected, Another act of intimidation shook the cul-de-sac. Fireworks were set off directly in the homeowner's yard, loud, blinding, deliberate. The explosions shattered the night air, waking the entire street. Neighbors poured from their homes, some shouting, some filming, as the display turned from noise to smoke to scorched grass. It was reckless, dangerous, and desperate. And it was the board's last card. Because the very next morning, as smoke still lingered faintly in the air, patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood. Deputies emerged not for patrol but for action. The board president, once so smug, was led away in handcuffs. Other board members followed, pale and silent, their authority stripped away in an instant. The neighborhood, long silenced by intimidation, stood at windows and porches, watching the collapse unfold in real time. The sheriff, calm and steady, explained that charges were being filed: impersonation of law enforcement, fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and conspiracy. Years of fear, control, and abuse had come crashing down in a single morning. Yet as the patrol cars rolled away, as neighbors whispered in stunned disbelief, one thought lingered in the air. The arrests might have ended the board's reign, but they did not erase the damage left behind. The neighborhood was fractured, trust was shattered, and scars would remain long after the handcuffs clicked shut. And for the homeowner, the battle was not quite over, because tucked into the mailbox that very morning, unnoticed until the deputies had gone, was a single unmarked envelope. Inside was a scrap of paper. Hastily torn, the handwriting jagged. "This isn't finished." The morning the board was arrested marked the end of one era and the uneasy beginning of another. For years, the HOA had been the shadow that ruled the neighborhood, dictating paint colors, lawn heights, and holiday decorations with a heavy hand. Their authority had felt absolute, unquestionable. But now, with patrol cars rolling away and handcuffs flashing in the morning sun, that illusion had shattered. The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors stood in driveways, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Some shook their heads in disbelief, whispering about how it had come to this. Others spoke openly for the first time, admitting that they had long suspected corruption, though few had dared to name it aloud. The sight of the board president, once so untouchable, being led away by deputies was a spectacle none of them would forget. But victory was not celebration. The neighborhood, stripped of its rulers, was left to face the scars of what had been done. Trust had fractured like glass. Friendships strained under years of fines and intimidation did not mend overnight. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their past silence or complicity. Others clung stubbornly to loyalty, muttering that the board had been framed or targeted unfairly. The homeowner, at the center of it all, found no joy in the collapse. Relief, yes, but relief laced with exhaustion. The notes taped to the door, the vandalism, the shattered window, the fireworks in the yard, all of it lingered like ghosts in the corners of the house. And the final scrap of paper found in the mailbox, scrawled with the words, "This isn't finished," weighed heavily in the mind. The sheriff treated the threat seriously, but his voice carried reassurance. The arrests had dismantled the board's core leadership, leaving only fragments behind. Still, he admitted that loyalty runs deep and desperate allies sometimes lash out long after their leaders are gone. Patrols would continue. Surveillance would remain. But healing, he warned, would take longer than enforcement. The investigation expanded beyond the neighborhood. County auditors uncovered years of misused funds, thousands siphoned through fake fines and fabricated special assessments. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was theft, plain and simple. The embezzled money had funded vacations, home renovations, even vehicles. What had been sold to residents as community upkeep had been feeding the board's pockets. Court proceedings stretched for months. The board president faced the heaviest charges: impersonation of law enforcement, fraud, harassment, and conspiracy. Other members faced lesser but still damning counts of embezzlement and aiding intimidation. The courtroom, once filled with their arrogance, now echoed with the sound of consequences. Neighbors watched the trials unfold like episodes of a grim drama. Each revelation was more damning than the last, each witness testimony more chilling. Stories emerged of late-night visits, of compliance checks that were little more than shakedowns, of residents bullied into paying cash to avoid further action. For some, it was vindication. For others, it was humiliation, proof that they had been manipulated for years. Meanwhile, the HOA itself collapsed under the weight of scandal. Without leadership, without funds, and with its very charter under legal scrutiny, the association was suspended by the state. Its accounts were frozen, its authority revoked. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from its iron grip, but freedom brought chaos. Rules that had once dictated every detail now hung in limbo. Lawns grew wild, fences went unpainted, holiday decorations sprouted in every shape and color. Some residents embraced it as liberation, others decried it as disorder. The uniformity that had once defined the community dissolved into individuality, and with it came both beauty and friction. Meetings were held to decide what came next. Some argued for a new board, one rebuilt on transparency and fairness. Others wanted no HOA at all, insisting that neighbors could govern themselves without an overseer. The debates were heated, sometimes bitter, as years of pent-up frustrations spilled out into the open. The homeowner attended, but never spoke much. They had become a symbol, admired by some for standing up, resented by others for stirring chaos. Every nod of gratitude was matched by a glare of blame. Living under a spotlight was its own kind of burden, yet amid the turmoil, something subtle began to change. Conversations once whispered grew louder. Neighbors who had never spoken before now gathered in clusters, discussing possibilities, debating futures. Walls of silence were crumbling. People were talking, really talking, for the first time in years. The sheriff, though his role diminished as arrests turned into prosecutions, remained a quiet presence. He visited occasionally, checking in not just as an officer, but as a reminder that law had triumphed over fear. His arrival was no longer met with suspicion, but with nods of respect. He had been the turning point, the weight that shifted the balance when the board's intimidation had grown too bold. Months later, when the trials ended and sentences were handed down, the neighborhood was forever changed. The board president received years in prison. Others received fines, probation, or community service. The story made local news, then regional news, then spread online, where it was consumed like scandalous entertainment. Headlines spoke of HOA corruption, fake cops in suburbia, and the neighborhood that fought back. But for those who lived there, it wasn't entertainment. It was lived reality. It was nights of fear, days of intimidation, friendships broken and trust betrayed. It was the slow, painful process of learning that power abused leaves scars deeper than rules ever could. The homeowner never forgot the sound of boots on the porch, the counterfeit badges, the threats scrawled in ink. They never forgot the neighbors who avoided their eyes, nor the ones who quietly slipped notes of thanks into their mailbox. And they never forgot the sheriff standing on their doorstep, his steady presence the first real sign that the truth would prevail. In time, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. Some lawns remained wild, others neatly trimmed. Some houses displayed strings of lights year-round, others stood bare. It was messy, inconsistent, imperfect, but it was free. The homeowner found peace not in victory, but in survival. They had stood against intimidation, endured threats, and watched corruption unravel. They had paid the price in sleepless nights and fractured friendships, but they had endured. And though the final note in the mailbox had warned that it wasn't finished, nothing more came of it. Perhaps it had been the last gasp of a crumbling regime, a hollow threat with no teeth. Or perhaps it was a reminder that power, once tasted, never fades entirely, only waits for the chance to rise again. Either way, the homeowner learned a truth that lingered long after the trials ended. HOAs, like any form of power, are only as strong as the silence of those they govern. Break that silence, and the facade crumbles. And sometimes it takes only one door opening to the real sheriff to bring the whole house of cards crashing down. And just like that, the HOA's reign of terror came to an end. The board that once ruled with fake fines and phony threats ended up in real handcuffs, their entire scheme exposed for the fraud it was. The neighborhood? Still a little messy, still healing, but finally free. And all it took was one homeowner refusing to back down, and one sheriff who knocked on the door at exactly the right time. So what do you think? Was this the wildest HOA meltdown you've ever heard of? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button if you enjoyed the story, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable HOA and Karen drama. Until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and watch out for those fake cops.